Somehow, 15 years ago, League of Legends was unleashed into the world. Unfortunately, time travel hasn't been invented yet, so I can't go back to stop myself from installing it, but I can show you what it used to look like. Because, believe it or not, it didn't always look like this. Let's go back to Season 1. Yorick actually only has one ability, it just kind of comes in 3 different colours. He has Spawn a Ghoul in blue, Spawn a Ghoul in green, and Spawn a Ghoul in orange. His ult is also a revive, probably one of the most unfun champions to play against. F tier. Karma used to be different. She was the only champion in Season 1 to have an ultimate that wasn't really a traditional ultimate. Instead of it being one big ability, it just buffed her other abilities, and her W was also one of the most weird, convoluted abilities in the game, even by today's standards.
Second is Spirit Bond. Spirit Bond tethers an ally or enemy to Karma. Karma gains movement speed while the target gains or loses movement speed if it's an ally or enemy respectively. Additionally, units who move through the tether also gain or lose movement speed. Enemies who pass through the tether also take damage.
Trying to convince your teammates to run through this ability to get buffed was almost impossible, but it was still kinda cool. C tier. Sona. Basically the exact same champion. D tier. Bowser's favourite champion used to look like this. He got one of the first ever full reworks in League of Legends, and it's arguably the best one that they ever made. His old Q was a point and click stun that lasted for 2 seconds and scaled with 100% AP. His W was still a shield, but it scaled with 200% AP. Absolutely disgusting. S tier. Warwick was one of the original 16 champions released with League. His kit was more simplified and his ult was the same, except it was a point and click blink rather than a skill shot. C tier. Katarina. A tier. Interestingly enough, Trundle's abilities have remained the same for the past 14 years. His appearance, however, has not. D tier. Gangplank's passive used to be called Grog-Soaked Blade, and instead of placing barrels, his E was this.
Raise Morale passively gives Gangplank increased attack damage and movement speed. When activated, Gangplank gains an even larger bonus to these stats, and grants a smaller bonus to nearby allied champions as well.
His ultimate also landed in random places rather than being evenly spread out in a circle. Riot decided they don't want to condone hitting people with an alcohol knife, so they changed the name of his passive to Trial by Fire, making him a little bit more family friendly. But I'm not Riot, so this gets an A tier. I'm just gonna let Freak explain his kit because this is one of the weirder ones.
First is Acid Hunter. He fires a simple physical damage missile to the target location and applies his passive. Terror Capacitor is second. Urgot places a shield on himself, which absorbs damage. Until it breaks or times out, his basic attacks and his Acid Hunter slow the targets he hits. While the slow is short, it can stack upon itself. Third, Urgot may cast Noxian Corrosive Charge. This is an area of effect nuke which deals damage over time, lowers armor, and most importantly, allows Acid Hunter to lock onto the target. Now, if you cast Acid Hunter with your cursor over the target, it will always hit. Urgot's ultimate is the Hyperkinetic Position Reverser. He stuns his target and channels for a second, swapping positions with the target and slowing him, while Urgot briefly gains armor and magic resist.
Besides his ult and his kit feeling generally pretty clunky, he was actually one of the highest damage champions in the game. Plus, his E and Q combo had some of the longest range in the game. His ult was useful in lane for swapping someone under your tower, and that's pretty much it. Try to use it in a team fight, and you're just going to end up swapping yourself into their whole team. B tier. Evelynn. Her Q was pretty similar, and her W was a movement speed buff, and her E did damage and gave her attack speed. Her ult made spikes come up out of the ground in a circle, and she gained a shield that increased with the amount of enemies you hit, but that's not what we're here for. Evelynn's stealth used to be permanent until she used an ability. This allowed you to buy multiple Sunfire capes and run around doing damage to people while being completely invisible the whole time. S tier. Swain's old Q was a tether where his bird shot out a laser beam. His W was pretty similar, except it snared anyone that got caught in it. His E was a damage over time spell that amplified the damage each time you did damage while it was active. His ult was pretty similar, except instead of turning into a demon, he transformed into an actual bird. Oh, and in the champion spotlight, his picture is Karthus. B tier. Irelia's old Q was relatively similar, except she didn't stack her passive each time she used it. You would still get the reset though. Instead, her passive gave her increased tenacity the more enemies that she had around her. She had an entirely different W called Hit and Style, and that gave her passive lifesteal, and you can activate it to do true damage. Her E was a pretty unique ability actually. It would slow if you had more health than your enemy, and it would stun if you had less health. But then her ultimate was just Gwen ult. Strong, but kinda boring. C tier. Akali had a really insane amount of mobility for a champion in Season 1. She was also one of the few champions that could build hybrid, and that is as in AP and AD at the same time, which isn't really something that you see in Modern League. Her Q threw a mark that could be detonated for extra damage. Her W was still a shroud, although it looked a little bit different. Her E was an AoE slash, and her ultimate was her dash. You got 3 charges of this dash, and it was actually really fun to use even though it was point and click. I'm not too sure if this is an unpopular opinion, but I do actually miss this version of Akali, even if she had a bit less skill expression. A tier. Master Yi hasn't changed that much at all over the years, but there is one main difference. His abilities used to also scale with AP, which meant that you could rush Death Cap on him and it was kind of viable. In fact, there's even clips of it being pulled out in pro play.
Clears the gap. There's the Nunu ult. Managed to get the full channel on that one.
And now Genji's here as well.
With the Zonian Zargoth out on the edge of the fight. One more Alpha Strike. He can get another triple here. That is one.
Oh, the Master Yi Penta.
That's a triple. That's a quadra. And the chase. Penta kill. Penta kill.
Even though it was annoying to play against, this was one of the most fun builds to play in early League. S tier. Caitlyn's the exact same, except for some reason she's wearing a giant purple top hat. F tier. Maokai's R used to create a giant circle on the ground, and everyone on your team inside the circle would take reduced damage. You could then reactivate it to deal damage based on how much damage was reduced. Pretty interesting idea, but it was a bit awkward to use in solo queue. His Q, W, and E were basically the same. C tier. Udyr in Season 1 looked a lot different. His Q, W, and E were somewhat similar, but his R just sort of shot flames out in a circle around him. Maxing R was probably the most common way to build him, but you could also opt for a Q max and start with something like Elixir of Fortitude, which was an old item that gave you bonus AD and health when you popped it, and you could use this to try and cheese first blood.
I see, what do you call it here? Boom, I hit her, boom, slap her across the back, the side, neck, boom, hit her one more time. And there you go. I failed. I shouldn't have done that. I had that under control.
B tier. Kayle's Q used to be a point and click, her W was still a heal, and her E gave her AoE ranged attacks. She was still a strong late game champion because of her ult, but she was more balanced throughout the game stages rather than her late game being god tier and her early game just being piss. D tier. Season 1 Poppy is too old to even have an official champion spotlight from Riot, so here's one that I found from some German guy 13 years ago. Thanks. Poppy's old passive made her take less damage the lower that she got on health, and this effect was actually really noticeable, especially in extended fights. Her Q was a low cooldown auto attack reset, her W buffed her speed, damage, and armor. Her E was pretty similar, it was just a charge that would stun on impact with terrain. But her R was something else entirely. You would cast her ult on someone and it would make you immune to all other damage that didn't come from that person, and this includes towers. I think I literally have Season 1 PTSD from Poppy selecting me with her ult and subsequently running through my entire team and fucking me. She also had one of the most cursed looking skins to ever be created in League of Legends history. S tier. Orianna has had the exact same champion design since Season 1, and she's still managed to be a staple in both solo queue and competitive play alike for the last 14 years. If that's not a sign of good champion design, then I honestly don't know what is. F tier. Heimerdinger, one of the main characters of Arcane, the critically acclaimed League of Legends series. His abilities have always remained relatively similar. His Q places down a turret, his W still used to shoot missiles, but they randomly locked onto enemies instead of being a skill shot. His E was a grenade that stunned, and his R would upgrade all of his abilities at once rather than just one. Pretty straightforward stuff, but I'm not sure Arcane would have seen the same success if Heimerdinger still looked like this. D tier. Tristana was one of the original 16 champions that released with the game when you installed the League of Legends CD. She also had the benefit of having a free skin, which you could get for free if you followed Riot on their social media accounts, and I only just found out while making this video that you can't get it anymore, which makes me kind of sad. Her Q was an attack speed buff. That's literally it. Her W was her jump, and her E was a damage over time instead of the bomb that she has now, and her ult was the same. The big difference here is that building her AP was actually a viable option. As with a lot of champions in the Season 1 era, they had AD scalings and AP scalings. That, combined with Deathfire Grasp being an item, let her pretty easily one-shot someone with a full combo. A tier. Ryze is mostly known for being one of the hardest champions to balance in League, and going through about 6 reworks since his release in 2009. But in Season 1, he was pure point and click button mashing. His Q was point and click damage, his W was a point and click snare, and his E was point and click AoE. His ult was a buff that gave him move speed, spell vamp, and AoE damage on all of his spells. Simple, but iconic. B tier. Over a champion's lifespan in League, often their abilities are given visual updates to keep up with the rapidly evolving visual landscape of the game. Some champions need these more than others, and one champion arguably had one ability that needed a visual update more than anything else in the entire game. Yep, that is Karthus' Q. All of his abilities are the same, the visuals just reflect that of a game that was developed in the late 1980s. C tier. Nunu used to be a little bit different. Although his Q was the same, apart from it being unusable on champions, he was often taken as a support due to his old W, Blood Boil, which would buff his own and an ally's move speed and attack speed. On top of that, he had his old E, where he would throw an ice cube at an enemy, dealing damage and reducing their move speed and attack speed. He still had the same iconic ultimate, and his passive let him cast a spell for free after 5 attacks. Truly, this is a perfect look back through time at how simplistic old champions used to be. Q is a heal, W is a buff, E is a debuff, and then his R charges and does AoE damage after a channel. Everything explainable in one sentence. S tier. In League's beta, Twisted Fate was arguably the most overpowered character that has ever stepped foot on Summoner's Rift. His passive was a global crit increase for your entire team, his Q was the same, but his W was not. Blue card was a huge damage increase, and if you pulled one, you got the full cooldown refunded. Red was an AoE snare, and gold was an undodgeable AoE stun. His current ultimate, which is his global teleport, was just a basic ability. His E was Cold Gate, and it let him teleport anywhere on the map after a 3-second channel. His ultimate, Destiny, revealed everyone on the map, but it was also a global snare. But that was back in the beta, so when Season 1 came around, his abilities had already been moved around a little bit into the TF that we're a bit more familiar with today, with one exception. His ultimate was still global. A tier. Taric. What a dashing man. Most commonly known in the early days of League for being very close friends with Ezreal. His Q was a heal, and his W gave armor passively to himself and the allies around him. But it did have an active as well. He could choose to shatter the armor to lose his own buff but debuff the enemies around him and temporarily give himself more damage. His E was a point and click stun. You're probably noticing a theme by now where a lot of champions used to have point and click hard CC, but most of them have been removed by now since Riot decided they were unhealthy for the game. The same goes for other forms of CC, like silencers and dodging, but that's another rabbit hole entirely that I won't get into right now. His ult would slam his hammer into the ground, dealing AoE damage and also giving nearby allies AD and AP for a duration. A pretty straightforward champion, but then also pretty one-dimensional and bland to play. D tier. Pantheon's old Q was fairly similar, apart from it being point and click. His W and E were also fairly similar, along with his ult, apart from it appearing like this when he used it. The big difference here was after attacking or casting a spell 4 times, his passive gave him a shield that would block the next attack, even if it was a tower shot. Very, very annoying to play against. C tier. Mordekaiser is another champion that's been through quite a few iterations, but in Season 1 his kit was particularly interesting. His passive gave him a shield for 17.5% of the damage dealt by his abilities, and this was doubled against champions. Except it didn't appear as a typical shield would, it was an entirely separate bar beneath his health bar, which was especially confusing for new players. His Q made his next attack deal bonus damage and also bounced to 3 additional enemies. His W would summon a cloud of metal shards around a target, dealing AoE damage around them. This could also be put on your own minions to harass someone in lane if they wanted to last hit. His E dealt damage in a cone, and his R would do damage over time to an enemy for the next 10 seconds. If they died while this debuff was on them, they'd be reanimated as a ghost with bonus stats for the next 45 seconds and be controllable by Mordekaiser. B for Brazil tier. Ezreal was basically the same, except his W was a skill shot that granted attack speed to any allies that got hit by it. Usually this was a pretty useless ability, like sure it could pass through minions, but you were buffing other people as an ADC, and the only way that you could actually get it to affect you was to E or flash in front of the projectile after you'd shot it. But again, as with a lot of champions in the game's early days, this ability scaled really well off of AP, and thus AP Ezreal was born. Although most of the abilities are the same, Ezreal's getting A tier just because the old AP build was one of the most fun things that you could play back then. Shen's old kit was far simpler than the one that he has today. His Q was a point and click ability that would mark an enemy. If you or an ally attacked them while marked, you would regain health. His W was a shield, and that's pretty much it. His E and R were basically the same as they are today, except taking dodge runes sometimes made it easier to get your ultimate off. Yes, dodge runes were a real thing. C tier. Old Xerath probably had one of the most nonsensical passives in the game. He would convert 15% of his AP into armor, which is not completely useless, but for an artillery mage who doesn't want to be close to his enemies anyway, it felt a little bit redundant. His old Q would do damage in a line. You couldn't charge it or anything like you can today, it just shot damage in a line. His W was a self root. You'd lock yourself in place, but in return, gain 400 range and bonus magic pen on your spells. His E was a point and click spell that didn't do a crazy amount of damage, but it would place a mark for 3 seconds that could be procced by your other spells for a 1.5 second stun. His ult would let you call down 3 barrages, which is kind of similar to his current ult, but it definitely looked a whole lot different. I have a soft spot for Xerath since he was one of my first mains around 14 years ago, but I cannot deny that this was one of the most clunky champions that has ever existed in League. D tier. Believe it or not, Graves never actually used to be a jungler. He was an AD carry. He didn't have the shotgun reload mechanic that he has today, he would just auto attack like normal. His Q shot out 3 projectiles that did damage, and his W was still smokescreen, and his E was still a dash, but it would give him bonus attack speed every time he did it. The cooldown of this ability was also reduced each time he auto attacked, and then the ult was basically the same. C tier. Fiora's old passive regenerated health each time that she did damage. Her Q would dash to a target enemy, and she could cast it again for free in the next 4 seconds after using it. Her W was still riposte, but it would just parry a basic attack and reflect some of the damage back. Her E was an attack speed steroid that would make her attacks give her move speed as well. Her ultimate was honestly pretty iconic. She would dash around the team like crazy, dealing damage and applying on-hit effects to anyone that she hit. B tier. Veigar has no dashes, but that's okay because neither does anyone else. His Q is a point and click ability that grants him AP every time it lands. All of his other abilities can be described in one sentence. Amazing. He also has one of the only skins that you can buy with the free RP that Riot gives you for hitting level 3. As for builds, you can rush Deathfire Grasp on him to do some serious damage. You could also one-shot towers with his auto attacks. A tier. There's a couple of champions that didn't make this list, and for the most part, it's just because they haven't changed in the last 14 years, like Cho'Gath or Zillion or something. Actually, never mind, there's one more. Galio used to be colourful. A tier. Alright, that's it. Make sure to subscribe. Bye.